Hi, and welcome again to the Apologist bookshelf. Gary Zacharias here. There's a book that came out in 2022 by Doug Groothuis called Fire in the Streets that I just had a chance to read for the first time, so I'm going to be doing some podcasts on it. It's subtitled How You Can Confidently Respond to Incendiary Cultural Topics. Incendiary is just putting it mildly, isn't it, what we're facing? I wanted to tell you, first of all, just the kinds of reactions that this book has gotten from some people that I honor and think do a wonderful job in the area of apologetics. One is Os Guinness. He says for people that think shallow thinking, they know shallow thinking won't win any arguments, and witty put-downs and hard-hitting one-liners won't change any minds. He says Groothuis has given us a deep dive into the ideas behind the radical left. He says it's clear, it's comprehensive, and cogent. Guinness says the book is for all who care about the American experiment and who wish to respond to the present crisis constructively. Well, who doesn't? I mean, we're seeing our country under attack with some bad ideas. Another person I admire a lot is J.P. Moreland. He says, let's see if I can find something good here. Fire in the Streets says it's a carefully, intellectually informed, heartfelt, and bold treatment of a range of social, ethical, and political topics that constitute today's chaotic culture. It says, be prepared when you read the book for hard-hitting, straight talk backed up with carefully crafted arguments. And then Sean McDowell. It's a timely and eye-opening book. It says he does a biblical and philosophical critique of critical race theory that Christians need to take seriously. So I think this would be a wonderful book to do as a study. Get a group of people together from your church or from your own Bible study, whatever it is, and go through this book. It's really powerful. I'm just going to give you the first podcast will be a look at his preface and his opening comments, first chapter. So he says he's trying to avoid cliches and just talking points, things like that. He says a conservative, in Groothuis' sense, holds what Thomas Sowell calls a constrained vision of human nature, institutions, and history. So what does that mean? That when we look around us, we realize humans are constitutionally limited in their knowledge and their goodness. So what does that mean? Well, therefore, when you try to set up social ideals and political ideals, aims for what ought to be accomplished, he says they should be calibrated accordingly to avoid utopian ends that are unachievable and actually end up being deleterious to society. So let me stop at that point, just have you think about that for a minute. If you have an unconstrained vision of human nature, in other words, it can just get better and better, and there's really no weakness there. We just need better schools, we need better education, we need better monetary systems and better politics, whatever it is. If we say humans are not limited in their knowledge and goodness, right? They're perfectible. What are you going to get? You're going to get a utopian idea that when it's put into practice ends up just ruining society. I think of right now Venezuela is a great example. Cuba, Pol Pot in Cambodia was a terrible example of this. Mao's China, Stalin's Russia. You can just go on and think about all these utopian societies that were going to achieve some wonderful things. So he's saying, back to Groothuis, he says statecraft should be doing things like establishing and preserving order, policing the law, conserving, right, there's that word again, conserving, historic institutions like the nuclear family and the church, and making sure everybody has legal equality. That should be a fundamental right. So he says, compare that to the unconstrained vision, right? So he says, Thomas Sowell talked about a constrained vision of human nature, but he says, unlike the constrained vision, he says, this account denies that any kind of social program or revolution will bring about a society that'll somehow bypass our basic selfishness and our other limitations. So he says a conservative is skeptical of any plan that says we can eliminate poverty, we'll eliminate racism, sexism. Says humanity's not subject to such perfections. He says we end up, like the American War on Poverty, he said, made matters worse. And he said so do many of the efforts today to eliminate racism and other social ills. So Groothuis says a conservative tries to ameliorate ills, make them less prominent as much as possible, and the conservative is quick to critique unrealistic attempts to change human nature. I mean, that's crucial. Is human nature malleable? And I don't think so. And Groothuis doesn't believe so. So he says conservatives, since they're viewing life in this constrained way, are eagle-eyed to spot some bad consequences of political overreach. He said they're well-meaning measures, wonderful things that people are trying to do, like minimum wage laws. That's a great idea. Bring more money to more people. Preferential admission policies based on race. Well, that sounds fair. Taxing the rich at a higher rate than others, isn't that good? Affirmative action, isn't that good? He said, but they end up doing more harm than good. He said, now, coming up to right now, we have this anti-racism idea. He said, that's even more dangerous. It's a colorful name. And he said, it all kind of gets summed up as the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. And he then turns to David Horowitz for a comment. I've read some of Horowitz's books and listened to him before. He was a radical. Boy, he was the son of some Reds. And he turned conservative. He said, here's another aspect of the conservative vision. This is Horowitz now. Conservative principles are about limits. He says, by contrast, still Horowitz, progressive views, that's part of critical race theory, are built on expectations about the future. They have ideas about a future that doesn't exist. For progressives, the future is not a bunch of uncertainties. No, it's a moral choice. You just have to will it to achieve this social justice. So Groothuis says, okay, he said, all progressives, especially those that push CRT, focus more on denigrating the status quo. They start calling it racist, sexist, homophobic, classist. They're far more interested in doing that than on preserving legitimate institutions. And they don't explain how this social justice would play out. It's idealism, he says, unshaped by realism. Okay, I think that's crucial. That's really good. Idealism is unshaped by realism in their world. He quotes from a Black Lives Matter leader, Hawk Newsom. If this country doesn't give us what we want, then we'll burn down the system and replace it, all right? And I could be speaking figuratively. I could be speaking literally. It's a matter of interpretation. He said, well, we know what the interpretation is. We've seen some of the riots. Now, he says, you may be wondering, well, this sounds more like a political book. Well, it is some. But as he ends the preface here, he said, this constrained vision is founded on a Judeo-Christian worldview of humanity. What does he mean? Well, we are made in the divine image, no doubt about that. But he said we're fallen and we're sinful. You look at Genesis, you find us being made in the divine image. He said, look in Romans 3, 9 to 20. He said, we are unique. We're uniquely valuable. But we're prone to selfishness and self-deception and cruelty. Now, what do we need? How do we get out of this? So that's what we are as people. These are going to be worldview questions, by the way. What are we as humans? How do we see ourselves? And then what's gone wrong and how do we solve it? So he said, well, the Christian view is we're unique, we're uniquely valuable, but we're prone to selfishness and self-deception and cruelty. So there's the problem. What's the remedy? What's the solution? He says the ultimate remedy is divine deliverance. We don't have the capacity to deliver ourselves. That's what separates us from every other ism around today. Now, this is me talking instead of Groothuis, but you look at things like communism. Okay, it says people are messed up, and here's the solution, but the solution is a worldly solution. You work at it. You change human nature. And if some of the humans don't want to change, you put them in camps or you do something awful to them. But eventually, humans are malleable. But he says, no, Groothuis says, people are prone to selfishness, self-deception, and cruelty. We need Jesus. It's divine deliverance. Jesus is Savior and Lord. He says, but, he said, even though you can become a Christian, he said, it doesn't mean you're going to become an angel upon conversion. Many never really convert. So he said, any social or political policy should heed these rebellious, broken people that we are. Understand that we have failings. We have outright evil. And so he said, let us begin. He said, I just ask that the reader read carefully, check the documentation, and endeavor to serve God and others. He said, even though there's fire in the streets and fire in the minds of men and women. Yeah, I think he's got that right. So he starts off in the first, the intro. I don't know how much time I'll spend on that, maybe a little bit here. But he talks about some of these examples of what's going on. In Cupertino, California, an elementary school forced first graders to deconstruct their racial and sexual identities and rank themselves according to power and privilege. The Treasury Department held a training session that told staff members virtually all white people contribute to racism, and they have to convert everybody to anti-racism. And he said, so what's behind all of this is something called CRT, critical race theory. So I'll cover that. I do a talk on this, although I call it contemporary critical theory. I can explain why another time. But so you may have heard of it as critical race theory. So where'd it come from? Well, it was a form of neo-Marxism at one time, just called critical theory. And so that divided everybody into oppression all across the board. It was not just workers versus owners. It was not just economic problems. It morphed into CRT when legal scholars added more than economics. Now they added race to it. So they said racism is part of America. It's evident in the law. He said CRT claims America is systemically racist. So there's no getting away from it. It's a pretty negative view. And the entire social system disadvantages any non-whites, especially African Americans. So any discrepancy that you ever see between African Americans, let's say, and whites, any discrepancy in their achievements is due either entirely or at least primarily to this systemic racism. And so it's claimed that this idea of racism, it's been there from the very beginning. And he references something called the 1619 Project. It's a journalism project of the New York Times. It tries to reframe, I guess you'd say, national history. And it claims America was founded on racism when the first slaves were brought here in 1619. So if you talk about American exceptionalism, he said that's racist. That's xenophobic to the CRT people. So, basic assumption, all white people are racist, say the CRT people. Now, they grant that not all white people have some explicit ill will toward African Americans, but because they're part of this racist system, they participate in it just by being white. So they have to be taught to realize this. White people, especially heterosexual white males, are oppressors. And they'll use terms like, and he goes through a few terms here, white privilege. That's all the benefits that whites get, that minorities don't get. Economic benefits and cultural benefits and emotional benefits. Another term is called white supremacy. White people will fight to keep that privilege, even if they do it unconsciously. Then there's racial essentialism. He said that's a tricky term. It says the CRT people will say that race is constructed. It's not inherent. It's postmodern. But he said, on the other hand, race is what determines whether you're an oppressor or oppressed. He says how this conflict is resolved escapes Doug Groothuis. Yeah, there's a lot of the theory I think is pretty fuzzy. Here's some other terms that he focuses on. Standpoint epistemology. That's a mouthful. But Groothuis says it's the belief that minorities have a privileged perspective on matters of racial oppression. They have lived experience, and that is the reality. If someone questions that perspective, then that person is racist. So, as an example, a CNN host named Don Lemon, he often speaks of his truth as a gay black man. Here's another term, intersectionality. It says that if you're in several oppressed categories, like let's say you're black and lesbian, or you're a Hispanic transgender person, those people are more oppressed, and they have a more reliable vantage point. They're credited to be higher in society, or should be in society. And he says there's identity politics. He says that's the norm. You don't think about people as individuals created equal before God and the law. You're part of a group. It's group over the individual, and you got to be treated accordingly. So that's why we get all these hyphenated adjectives, African American, Hispanic American, and others. One more term, microaggressions. He said that's commonly perceived by CRT enthusiasts. So given above all these above points, white people often disrespect and disadvantage African Americans and other minorities, but they do it through real subtle figures of speech and gestures. And if somebody who's a minority member feels there's a microaggression, then that can't be questioned, and it has to be dealt with. He says toward the end of this intro, free speech is not typically valued in CRT. Why? Well, some speech is tainted at the source, so it doesn't have the right to be heard. And we've seen that. He mentions public officials or private citizens have been deplatformed at public events. They won't let them speak, or they've been banned from social media. CRT does not like that older American idea of an open marketplace of ideas. He said they see that as just a prop for white privilege. So as he ends this first chapter, he said, when we address this fire in the streets and the fire in the minds in the pages ahead, he said, we have to do a lot more than just extinguish a bad idea. We have to ignite a better fire. So I like that. Instead of just a book of complaints, he offers ways around. So he said, we need to ignite a better fire, one that burns away all this negative stuff and gives us the warmth and energy we need to walk wisely, both with the living God, he says, and with our neighbor. So there's how it gets on its way. Just to give you an idea as far as the types of topics, how the blaze got started. So he gives you the historical background. Second section, burning it all down. So he says, what is America? Should we just burn America? Does it have anything good about it? And then he moves to more combustible topics like ideology and free speech. What about the free market? What about race and identity? And then, I like it at the end, a better fire. He says, a Christian framework and fanning holy flames. So it ends on a very positive thing. It's not a long book, by the way. It's just a little over 200 pages, and a lot of those are notes. So you know he did a lot of work as he put this together. As far as the book itself, 197 pages, it's not hard to read. It's, as somebody's called it, wise Christian counsel to Americans who are concerned about this critical race theory. And I think we all should be. It's doing a lot of things, not just in our society. It's doing it in our schools. It's doing it in our politics. It's doing it in our churches. We're seeing this rising in churches as well. So this is something we need to be concerned with. I think we're actually beginning to see the downturn in CRT. At least that's my hope. Anyway, we'll do more with this book in a future podcast, but I appreciate you being part of this. And again, the book is called Fire in the Streets. Doug Groothuis is the author. Groothuis, Groothuis. A wonderful thinker. Thank you, and have a good day.